Let's now have a look at how we can actually dynamically add to our array. I've now created a very simple array of languages again. This time it's just a simple array without associated keys or anything like that. So it's just English, French, German, Spanish, and Polish. So in order to add to an array with default indexing, what we are going to do is to use the name of the array, then square brackets without anything in between, and simply equal symbol, and what we want to add, let's say Portuguese, and semicolon after this. Now if we try and echo, let's do pre-tags so we can actually see it a little bit better, then print R, and we go in for our languages, and then echo, closing pre-tag, and semicolon. Now if we save it and preview everything in the browser, refresh the page, and there we go. Portuguese has been added to the end of this array, gaining the index of 5. As you can see, by default, obviously, arrays are 0 index, so we're starting from 0 up to 5, so English got 0, and the new item is automatically associated index of 5 in this case. So if we go back to the editor, another way, if we had an associative array or multidimensional array, and as you may remember from one of the previous videos, multidimensional or associative array is the array when we actually are specifying the keys manually. So let's say EN for English, there for French was FR, DE for German, ES for Spanish, and there was PL for Polish. And now if I save it and preview everything in the browser, if we go, refresh the page, you can see as long as we've been associating keys manually with the values, then we keep these keys the way they are. But any new item without key being specified will start gaining the default indexing. In this case, we're going to start from 0, but because obviously previous items are of the string values. If, let's go back to the editor, if we specified, let's say 5, 6, 7, 20, and 100, and if I now preview everything in the browser, refresh the page, you can see that because our last item in the array had the highest obviously number here, and it was 100, the new item will gain the next number basically available after the index of the last item. So that's how it works basically with default adding items with default indexing without actually specifying strictly what we want the index to be. But if we go back, and I'm just going to reverse all this, and now I want to add the Portuguese language with its associated key basically. So for Portuguese, we're going to have PT, and if I save it now, preview everything in a browser, refresh the page, and there we go. This has been added again to the end of the array, but with its associated key. If we now go back to our editor, you can mix string with integer keys. So if I now, let's say for Portuguese, I'm going to specify the index as 300 rather than having this, this standard string key. If I refresh it, it works as well. So you can obviously mix integers with string keys within arrays. But what happens if I try and specify the key that already exists in our array? Let's say for Portuguese, what happens if I just use ES key? Let's have a look at this in the browser. You'll see that when I refresh, it simply replaces the existing one. If the key that you are specifying exists in array, then it's going to be overwritten. So very often you should be first checking whether the key which you're actually trying to use exists. And there is a function for this as well. We're going to have a look at this pretty soon. But if you are actually using the key that is already in use within this specific array, then it will simply overwrite it. So that's how we're working with adding items using this approach. There are some other functions that we can use in order to add items to the array dynamically. If we go to php.net, so again, open our browser, go to php.net, and we start by typing array_push. So this is the function that pushes one or more elements onto the end of the array. If we look at the description, you can see ArrayPush function. It takes the array to which we actually want to add items, and then we can put a number of items that we actually want to add to this specific array. And it tells us that ArrayPush treats array as a stack and pushes the past variables onto the end of array. The length of array increases by the number of variables pushed, has the same effect as if we were basically adding them the way we just did in a previous exercise. One thing to know about this, if we go back to our editor, is that using ArrayPush, I'm just going to remove all this here. Using ArrayPush, we haven't got the power over the keys basically. So we can only add to the array this way with the numerical default indexing. So if we try and use it, let's quickly use this function, ArrayPush. And then we specify languages, and we want to add, let's say, Portuguese and Swedish as well. I'm just going to obviously separate this like that. Swedish, as you can see, I'm using obviously because Swedish is with E obviously, and I'm just going to put semicolon after this. Again, languages array is being used, if we go back to the specification for the specific function, is being used as a reference. As you can see, this and symbol before the beginning of the array name. And because it's used as a reference, we don't really have to associate the output of this function with our languages. So we just pass this array, and it's automatically, once we go and after this function has been run, these two items will be added to this array without us actually going again languages equals and basically trying to retrieve all of the values from this function, because that's not how it works. It's a reference, so that means whatever that function does is automatically going to be reflected in the original array that we are passing through as an argument. And you can put as many items here as you want to this specific function basically, so it's entirely up to you how many items you have. Basically you just separate them by comma. Obviously we are using strings here, but they can also be of different data type, they can be arrays and so on. But as I said, if we now try, and after using this ArrayPush, I'm going to again echo pre to format it, and then print R using languages array, and then closing pre tag. And if we now save it and preview it in a browser, if I go to our page, you can see that it's been added. It's added new items to the array, but because we can't really specify the key, it just takes the default numerical indexes starting from 0, obviously, because the previous ones had the string keys obviously associated with them. So if you go back to our editor, if I now remove these keys and make it just a standard array rather than associative one, if I now save it, go back to the browser, obviously this will change, and obviously the new items will take the next available index basically. So that's how we're doing this using the ArrayPush. One thing to know, if you're only adding one item at the time, when you actually need to add to the array, obviously then using ArrayPush may be a little bit of overkill, because you obviously have to call another function. So use the previous approach with the square brackets basically and the array in the name, so basically languages, and then obviously specify the value this way, because it's going to be a little bit quicker as well. But if you've got number of items they have to put in one go, then obviously this ArrayPush comes pretty handy. So that's how you add to the end of the array. There's another function that allows us to add items to the beginning of array. If we go back to our browser and to php.net, and let's look for the array underscore unshift. This is the function we're going to be looking at now. And what it does, it prepends one or more elements to the beginning of an array. And let's quickly have a look at the description. There we go. It takes array as an argument. Again, it takes it as a reference. So whatever this function is going to do, it's going to do it directly to the array. We don't have to associate the array again, the variable basically, with the output of this function. And then we pass the number of values that we actually want to add to the beginning of this array. So it works pretty much the same way as the previous function. The only difference is rather than to the end, it prepends them obviously to the beginning of the array. And what it does, all numerical array keys will be modified to start counting from 0, while literal ones won't be touched, which is exactly the same thing as with the previous one. The only difference is if we go back to the editor, let's try and use this function straight away and see what the output is going to be. So rather than push this time, we are going to use unshift. There we go. And if I save it and preview the whole thing in a browser, let's go to our PHP course.dev, refresh it. And as you can see, what's happened, the new items added to the beginning of this array gain specific 0 and 1 index purpose, and it's called array underscore splice. Had the index reset. There we go. If we select this one, we go to the documentation for this specific function, and it tells us that it removes a portion of the array and replaces it with something else. So let's have a look at the description here. We take in the array. Again, it comes as a reference. Then we specify the offset, the length, and the replacement. And it is of the array type. But it can also be just any other item type, basically. If you look at this note here, if replacement is not an array, it will be typecast to 1, i.e. array parameter. As you may remember, we've been discussing typecasting earlier. So if you put in a string rather than the array here, it will basically be typecast to the array, obviously resulting in the array. So what it does, it removes the elements designated by the offset, which is the second argument, and length, which is the third argument, from the input array and replaces them with the elements of the replacement array, if supplied. And as you can see, only the first and the second argument are mandatory, because the other ones are in between the square brackets, meaning they are optional. Let's quickly have a look at the parameters of this function. The first one is just an array, which we're going to be passing in. Then we have offset. If offset is positive, then the start of removed portion is a dot offset from the beginning of the input array. If offset is negative, then it starts that far from the end of the input array. Let's quickly go to our editor and let's give it a try. So we are using ArraySplice, and now we specifying the offset. I'm just going to remove these options for now, and let's say I'm going to specify the offset as 3. As we know, the following two arguments are mandatory, so we only have to specify the 2 of them. Let's now save it, go back to our browser, go to phpcourse.dev, refresh it, and as you can see, we only get 3 items. Because what happened here is basically we specify the second argument as 3, and the 3 means the third index, basically. So we've got 0, 1, 2, and the 3, which was, if we go back to the editor, Spanish, from that one onwards, everything gets removed from the array, basically. So we splice here the array, so we only got the first 3 items, obviously starting from 0. If we now go back to the browser, let's have a look at the offset again. If offset is negative, then we're obviously going to start removing from the end of the input array. So let's go back to our editor and let's try to do it -3. So if we go now and check that in the browser, refresh the page, and there we go. So what we did here now, we still have English and French, but we only have 2 items obviously here now. So if we go back to the editor and see why this has happened, it's -3 means we want to remove 3 items from the end of the array. So we started from Polish, Spanish and German are now removed, and only English and French remained within the item. So that's what the negative basically does to it. So it's rather than starting from the third index, as it would be by using the positive number, with -1, we're specifying how many items from the end of the array we want to remove.